Okay, right over here at all times you're going to see the frame rate and the shutter speed that I'm filming at. And it's always going to be in 1080p. I'll adjust the ISO as I need. I'll adjust the aperture as I need. But I'm not going to list those because they're not important in this video. Right now I'm shooting at 24 frames per second, or I think it's technically 23.976. So my shutter speed is 50. If you look down at your hand right now, as you're watching this video, stop and look at your hand and wave it back and forth like this, and you're gonna see this blurriness. Your hand's gonna look kind of smudgy, and your natural view of the world using your own two eyes, you're gonna see this natural motion blur occurring. Now, since I have my frame rate at 24 frames per second and my shutter speed at 50, that's when you're gonna get that look in your camera shot. So when I'm waving my hand like this right now, it should look remarkably similar to what you're seeing in real life when you do that in front of yourself. Say I wanted to have a scene where I have my character was drugged and he's hallucinating and he's all drugged out. Somebody slips something into his drink and he's like, oh my god, what's going on? Well, watch what happens to my shutter speed. My frame rate's gonna stay the same. My shutter speed's gonna go down, and look what happens next. Right now, my shutter speed is at 1/8 of a second. So it's down from 50 to 8. And when I move, I'm getting that motion blur. So if I'm on drugs, I'm like, oh, what's going on? And then if I add a little bit of handheld camera movement to that, you're really, oh my god, I'm hallucinating, man. What was in that drink? Oh my god. Overall, it creates an effect that can be frantic, it can be disorienting, it can be trippy and psychedelic, or it can be very dramatic. So it's used in a lot of movies and music videos. But say we have an action scene, right? Where we want that motion to be crisp, and I bust in the door and I take out a bunch of bad guys. Well, watch this. Right now, I have my shutter speed at 160. 160 shutter speed. So when he comes busting through the door and all this action's happening, oh, you're not getting any motion blur at all. Everything is super crisp. A very famous example of overcranking footage would be in the movie Private Ryan, where they would overcrank when they were filming to bring this certain sense of hyper realism to the war scenes. Which doesn't look natural, but it does look cinematic in a certain way when you're trying to pull off that certain look. See? So you see the door bust open and fucking everybody swinging around, and I'm chopping legs and I'm breaking faces in an action scene, and the camera's whipping around. Boom, boom, boom. Oh, snap. What's going on there? And everything is super crispy. So that is overcranking. That's a higher shutter speed. So I've showed you undercranking and overcranking. Now again, this whole time we're shooting at 24 frames per second. Let's set our shutter speed back to 50. Now that we're back to normal, you can see it's not overly blurry, it's not accentuated blurry, but it's also not super crispy and crunchy. This is how it looks in real life, and this is the natural look, and this is the cinematic look. And if you look, most films in Hollywood traditionally, pick your favorite movie right now, 90% odds, 95% odds, it was shot just like this. 24 frames per second, 50 shutter speed, and this is the look that's going to give you the most natural cinematic look you're going for. But then there's an option of thinking about taking your footage and slowing it down. Well, if I take this 24 frames per second footage and I slow it down to 50% speed, it's gonna look like this. Pretty steppy, right? It kind of like is chunky and it's stepping all the way through. We can speed it up to 60 frames per second, so let's do that real quick. Right now I'm shooting at 60 frames per second. My shutter speed is set at 125. Now when I move, I'm getting that super sharp motion. I'm not getting that natural motion blur that I should be getting. That's that natural cinematic looking motion blur. But the thing is when we slow it down like we did before, it's not going to look all steppy. It's going to look really nice and smooth. So if we slow it down to 50% speed, you're going to get this type of action. so you can get some super cool, smooth, buttery slow motion. But if you're always shooting at 60 frames per second, you're not getting that natural motion blur. And even if you render it out at 24 frames per second, that motion blur was not captured in that exposure time in your footage, so there's no way to really recover that and to really make it look good. Your best bet when shooting real time is to shoot at that 24 frames per second, and then you're going to have a nice smooth motion blur. With my camera, the Canon 90D, I can shoot at 120 frames per second, but it's only going to shoot in 1080, so you can't like do punch-ins and things like that. And it doesn't shoot with audio. So let's go ahead and see. It actually burns it that way, so it prints it out as 120 frames per second. So I'm not even manually slowing it down in post. It's just going to be slow in post. As soon as I drop it into my timeline, it's just going to be slow-mo footage. And then you're going to get something that looks like this. And really the last thing to take into consideration is your exposure, and thinking about that, taking that consideration out. I actually didn't list ISO before or aperture because I just kind of left those where they needed to be to show you shutter speed and frame rate. But right now, I want you to know that I'm not going to adjust my ISO. Right now, my ISO is set at 1000. My aperture is at 5. My lens doesn't have a low f-stop for this lens in particular. So aperture is at 5, ISO's at 1000, and I have good exposure in this room. This is the light that I have in this room. This is what it looks like, right? So think about your low light situations. Think about when you're filming interior shots. Think about when you're filming in a dark space. I'm not going to adjust aperture. I'm not going to adjust ISO. I'm going to leave those exactly the same for everything I'm about to show you. This is 24 frames per second, 50 shutter speed, but if I punch that up to 60 frames per second, it's going to look like this. See how much darker I'm getting without moving my ISO, without moving my aperture? I'm shooting at 60 frames per second now, and you can see by the stiff motion blur, you can see that the room has become much darker. My aperture can't go any lower on this lens. I need to start punching up my ISO if I'm going to get proper exposure. So that's a problem, an additional problem to shooting at 60 frames per second if I'm not shooting for slow motion. Now let's try and do it at 120 frames per second, and again, that's not going to have audio on this camera, but let's see how much darker it gets. And again, I'm not going to adjust my ISO, I'm not going to adjust my aperture, I'm going to leave them exactly where they were, and let's see how it looks. See how much brighter is in here? So if I'm shooting at 24 frames per second, I'm going to get that natural, realistic motion blur. It's not going to be too much, it's not going to be too little. I'm going to have good exposure. I'm going to be able to deal better in low light situations, and this is the kind of look that I'm going to get. So this is the way they go, you know. If you see a movie in Hollywood, they're shooting at 24 frames per second, and you're going to be able to just adjust your aperture and your ISO, and this is the options you're going to have. So that's what there is to think about, and that's pretty much concludes this video. Alright.